Hi, welcome to School Finance. This is another lecture that is intended to help students understand a little more about the Kentucky School Funding and Allocation Formula called SEEK, or Support Education Excellence in Kentucky. We're going to proceed through an overview of SEEK, and then there'll be another follow-up video that will focus on how SEEK monies are allocated in 5 districts from the region. Before we start, I want to point out a couple of resources that are available in Blackboard during this week's session that you can access. One of those is the SEEK Executive Summary that is published by the Kentucky Department of Education. The other 2 documents are documents that are titled School Funding Explained and Kentucky School Fund Analyzed. Both of those provide additional opportunities for you to learn more detail and get a deeper understanding of how funding in Kentucky schools work. So we're going to start with, in this presentation, a little bit about SEEK funding and how it's determined. And then we will dig into actually the funding formula, the allocation formula, and see how districts acquire its money and then how they determine how that money is allocated at the school level. And then, of course, we'll look at school council and the role that the school council plays, and obviously the needs assessment process and how budgeting should work at the district level. So we're going to kick off the presentation with an overview of SEEK funding. And of course, SEEK funding is the funding program that was developed as a result of KERA, the Kentucky Education Reform Act of 1990. The Kentucky funding formula was one of the first of its kind that came as a response to a court case in the Kentucky Supreme Court called Rose v. Council for Better Education. The Rose decision, as it's called, started off with this notion that there were inadequate levels of support from the state for education in Kentucky. The court decision went further than just declaring the funding model unconstitutional. They declared the entire system of public schools unconstitutional, which really predicated one of the most aggressive and nationally known reform efforts with KERA. And of course, the funding was the core part of the case and a core part of what came out of the decision. And that's what we're going to talk about here. And that's where SEEK had its origin, was in the Reform Act. So let's start with understanding SEEK funding as we've defined it. It's composed of 3 parts. The first part is the base level, and then you have Tier 1 and Tier 2. And so this flow chart, you look at the components of SEEK funding and reading from the bottom up. First, there is the base or foundation grant, and this is a base minimum amount of money that you get from the legislature as they fund the per pupil allocation. Currently in 2023, this allocation is $4,100 per pupil. It's set by the General Assembly every other year in their biennial state budget that they pass. And so the funding formula typically goes up, but some years it remains constant. Each district's base funding is adjusted based on several factors. And we'll look at those factors, but above this base funding is funding called Tier 1. In Tier 1, we'll discuss this in just a moment, but Tier 1 is an equalization amount, and then Tier 2 is the final amount, and that is really based in additional local effort that we'll get into. And so the state guarantees, as I mentioned, a base amount of funding. It's currently $4,100 per pupil. And in each school district's base is adjusted by the following factors: the number of at-risk children to be served, because generally at-risk children are more expensive to serve than other children; the number of exceptional children to be served, and these are special education students, but sometimes it can be additional students, like students that are second language learners, that are language learners. And then the cost of transportation, and there are also formulas for the development of transportation funding based on the size of the district, how large the district is. And then the last one is the number of children who are homebound or hospitalized during the year. And so to receive the base allotment, one of the requirements is that you have local participation, which meaning that the local community agrees to tax itself to a minimum level of 30 cents per 1,000 of assessed property valuation. So when you get your tax bill, you see the value of your property from the local property valuation administrator, or PVA, and your tax is based on a set level. In the minimum case here, it's 30 cents per 1,000 of assessed value of the property, but that's the minimum. Most districts are far above that. Many of them are way far above that. The district that I represented had almost 70 cents per 1,000. And so property taxes are based on property values, but the district also may raise revenues by occupational taxes, which are taxes on wages, taxes on utilities, as well as excise taxes. And of course, some districts have occupational taxes, not all. Most have utility taxes, some have excise taxes. It can be confusing because city and county governments also have the opportunity to add these 4 types of taxes, and many of them have property, occupational, utility, and excise taxes as well. So let's dig into Tier 1 just a little bit. This is an additional pot of money that comes from the state, and it's something that can amount to an additional 15% above the SEEK base allotment. It's additional state money. Tier 1 is typically based on the overall wealth of the school district. So the guaranteed base for Tier 1 is 150 times the statewide average on taxable property per pupil. What this means is that if you have a property-rich district like Fayette County, one of the districts we'll look at, they're not going to receive that much, if at all, Tier 1 monies. Whereas if you have a property-poor districts in some rural parts of the state, or some of the urban parts of the state, you'll see property poor districts that are below the average statewide property valuation. And so they're going to get additional Tier 1 monies to equalize and give those areas that have less property value a more equitable way to fund their schools. And so the district raises revenue on its assessed valuation, and the state supplies the difference. So there is both a local and a state component of Tier 1. And Tier 2 is just additional monies. The district may raise another 15% of the base allotment. The voters in the district have to approve this in a referendum. And so Tier 2 is strictly local funds, no state funds provided. These are on top of state monies. And so let's take a look at the different funds that you see in school districts. We'll start with what we call the general fund. Sometimes it's referred to as Fund 1. If you look at different districts, this general fund consists of both state and local revenues generated through the collection of property taxes, utility taxes, occupational excise taxes, but it also can include federal and state grants and other revenues. Now, we're going to talk about these other revenues in the federal and state grants and categorical programs, and those funds are typically in Section 2, or Fund 2 as it's called, but most of the time those monies flow into Section 2 and then right into the general fund. And so skipping over that, we'll get to Section 3 here. Section 3 is basically the administrative cost of running a school district, and these funds are funds that operate the school system through district-wide expenditures that include things like administration, attendance, the operation of the plant, transportation, food service, all the funds for maintenance and plant operations, debt service, if you're bonding monies to pay for construction costs, health services, the instruction department at the district level, which typically includes the departments of special education to serve students with disabilities, and of course, all kinds of other operations. And so your district administrative costs go into what we call Section 3 or Fund 3. And so let's look at a series of categorical programs, and these are subtracted from the general fund because in many cases, there are restrictions on the use of these funds that are set by the funding agency or the authority. And so these categorical programs through Fund 2 allow you to keep them separate and then transfer them into the general fund for general use as is appropriate. And so Title I is one of those, and this is a federal grant program that's essentially money for students in poverty. Title II is teacher quality, leader quality programs in your district. Other title programs, things like Title IV, Title VI in special education, federal funds for preschool, federal funds for homeless education. There are all kinds of other programs for vocational education at the state level. There are extended school service funds. There are textbook funds, what we call now instructional resource funds, bus driver training, food service, gifted and talented, professional development, family resource youth service centers, and the educational technology system. And so these are all categorical programs that float between Fund 2 and the general fund, depending on the way the budget looks in the district. And so let's talk about Section 4. This is where we start getting into school level budgeting. Section 4, where Section 3 is really funds that fund the district as a whole and the administrative costs of operating a district. The Section 4 funds are really the allotment of teachers, and these allotments are based on enrollments. And so enrollment projections that you have for the coming year, you get an allotment based on the funding policy, the staffing policy of the district around cap size. So you get so many teachers per so many students at certain grade levels. These are ratios that determine the teacher-student ratio that you fund teachers. These monies are monies that fund salary. So the money actually doesn't flow to the district. What you get is the staffing at the district transferred to the school. Section 5 works the same way, except it's focused on classified positions. And again, these staffing allocations are really based in board policy. So as we move on to Section 6 monies, Section 6 monies are really the first monies that you actually get transferred into the school that are actual monies that you have some discretion in the way you spend it. And so this instructional material money, or textbook money as it has been called in the past, is based on the prior year average daily attendance, ADA. It can be increased or reduced at the end of the second month if your ADA changes. So if your enrollment goes down based on projection or it goes up based on projection, you could see that money fluctuate based on the change. Section 7 is really the remainder of the monies. And again, this is a set of funds that actually come into your school as money, where you have discretion. Your site-based council has the discretion in how you spend it. And so the balance between the amount generated in Sections 3, 5, 6, and the amount available for distribution to the SBDM council at the school level comprises Section 7. And so Section 7 funds are distributed typically in one of three ways. Most of the time it's done through an ADA based on the prior attendance of the previous year. But there are also circumstances where there are pupil needs that have been identified by the council and designated by the board, or a combination of the two, where those funds could be distributed differently. And then lastly, we'll talk about Section 9 funds. These are professional development funds, and they're allocated by the superintendent based on the 10th month of enrollment. At least 65% of the district's per pupil state allocation for PD must be allocated to the council. This allows the council to receive discretionary funds for professional development rather than the district taking a majority of the funds and determining how it's spent at the district level. It does give that local school autonomy. This amount should be included in the March allocation to the site-based council. So let's talk a little bit about the budgeting process. And budgeting is a process. It should begin with a needs assessment, and the budget is the end result and should be created only after a needs assessment has been completed and the funds have been allocated to the district. Budgets are typically revisited and revised as student needs changed. And so, of course, we talk about this different steps in the budget cycle, really starting in the fall of the year, October, November, with the needs assessment. Step 2 is then allocations that are really based on enrollment projections and prior year ADA that we've just talked about. And then step 3 is actually putting together the budget that takes place. And so the needs assessment process is an important process, and not all school districts and schools do it in a way that it should be done. So all stakeholders should be involved in the process. They should review data sources, analyze for cause and contributing factors, prioritize needs, identify goals, objectives, activities, align with your CSIP process. And then, of course, the site-based council has the final approval of the budget to address those goals. And so the way the process works at the district level, it really starts in October and November at the district level too. You look at initial allocations in March, but then you come back to it in May. The Board of Education is required in May to approve the budget, which is really a working budget based on those projections for the beginning of the fiscal year, which starts July 1 every year. The board will then revisit that budget in September once you're in month 2, and you look at any changes based on ADA. If your enrollment is up, then there's more money. If it's smaller, then there's less money, and adjustments have to be made. And that's the cycle that goes on every year. And as you can see, people in finance positions, superintendents, and principals are really juggling a couple of different budgets at a time. The prior year budget that you're closing out in June 30 of the year, the coming year budget, which you're starting in November the prior year to organize for it, and then the current year budget that oftentimes in July you're starting and you're still looking at projections and you're projecting out, and you're also looking at what occurred with the previous year budget. So council policy should really address all kinds of different data and information, and ultimately the council is responsible for setting the priorities of the school based on the results of the needs assessment and the data analysis, and the identified causes and contributing factors that impeded student performing at the proficient level should be determined through this process. And so aligning with your vision, with your instructional strategy and your school's overall strategy, looking at best practice to determine which activities produce the greatest impact on student performance, and all funds should be targeted towards student goals. The most significant personification of what your mission is in the budget that you approve every year. It's the best form of a mission statement that can be made. So we'll convene in our next video to look specifically about how the SEEK funding works at the level of 5 different districts.